Last time we spoke about the continued Soviet counteroffensive. The Red Army under General Zhukov and Rokossovsky resisted heavy German pressure towards Moscow and Rostov, while Stavka reshuffled commands to sustain pressure and tied down Army Group Center. A new Volkhov front under Merezhkov was instructed to break through the western Volkhov River line and encircle German forces around Leningrad. Within Leningrad, the siege deepened as famine worsened. Food rationing collapsed to near starvation, cannibalism emerged in extreme cases, and NKVD records documented thousands of cannibal arrests, though mass murder for ration cards remained more common. Despite dire logistics, the city's Kirov tank factory continued producing. About 490 tanks rolled out by December, bolstering the defenses. On the German side, Guderin's forces withdrew under immense pressure. Trying to navigate contracting lines and leadership, friction was escalating. In Sevastopol, Manstein intends to siege even as the Kerch landings loomed for a broader Soviet counteroffensive. This episode is the end of the first year. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before I begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. If after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. We are just commencing a new mini-series covering the Battle of the Atlantic. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 30 episodes and ongoing at this point, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The latest exclusive podcast episode is about the disastrous attack on Sydney Harbor during the Pacific War. If that's of interest to you, please go check it out. As the new year approached, the Wehrmacht and the Red Army were locked in brutal combat from the Arctic Circle to the shores of the Black Sea. Millions had already perished in the fighting, and there was no indication of any end in sight. Moscow had been spared from conquest for the year, and the Nazi war machine had been pushed back onto the defensive. As winter deepened, Stalin's advisors worked feverishly to assemble plans for the next phase of operations, schemes they hoped would liberate the rest of their beleaguered Union of the Soviets. In the meantime, the Red Army continued to press men and material against German defenses, hoping for a breakthrough that would end the war. General Zhukov and his comrades were not the only enemies the Germans had to contend with. They also faced the increasingly irrational demands of Die Führer, and the worsening winter weather continued to take its toll, causing casualties and limiting operations. Both sides were affected by the harsh weather, but many German units remained poorly equipped with cold weather gear and suffered accordingly. Frostbite cases were recorded for the tracking, even as the OKH excluded medical casualties from their accounting. Nevertheless, estimates suggested that as many as 130,000 men became frostbite cases during the December fighting, with varying degrees of severity. Now for Army Group North, the paramount issue was keeping Leningrad encircled. To achieve this, Shizelburg had to be held. It formed the end of what was known as the Shizelburg Corridor. The town sat at the mouth of the Neva River, where it flowed into Lake Ladoga. Even at the height of the German advance beyond the Volkhov River, the corridor had never been more than about 30 kilometers wide. The Soviet 54th Army had been battered and driven back, but it managed to hold the southern shore of Lake Ladoga. This prevented the Germans from gaining anything more than a precarious foothold on the lake. Nevertheless, the Germans had demonstrated their defensive skill throughout November and December in the area, fending off several small-scale attacks and 2 large-scale offensives designed to break the corridor. The last week of the year saw both sides nursing their wounds after the Volkhov-Tikhvin offensive, which had pushed the Germans back behind the Volkhov River. The Germans were still pulling forces back to their lines behind the river. Through Christmas Day, the situation remained relatively quiet. It wasn't until December the 28th that the Germans learned of the Volkhov Front's existence. Meretskov had been ordered to begin his counteroffensive to liberate Leningrad on Christmas Day. Despite reinforcements, he knew the operation would be a disaster without more time to prepare. His field armies had suffered terribly in the Tikhvin-Volkhov operations. The least he could do was press with the Stavka for additional time to rest and refit. He attempted this, but was quickly overruled. Only in the moments before he was to start his attack was he able to convince them of the need for more time. Stalin's representative was General Voronov. He was to inspect the readiness of the Volkhov front. He was shocked by what he found. Many guns lacked sights, limbers, or radios for battery control. The poor state of the rail lines east of Tikhvin contributed, with much of the equipment stranded mid-shipment. Voronov reported this to Stalin, skillfully shielding Meretskov from any blame. The new Volkhov front had not been given enough time to assemble a proper supply apparatus. This was part of the fault. Additionally, the occupation meant that many railway lines lay partly in German-controlled areas, rendering them unusable. Stalin up to that point had tended to treat every numbered field unit as fully operational, with all its equipment and personnel. He often failed to recognize that units required time to stand up. Man and material did not pre-exist in the places where armies and divisions were formed. In Meretskov's case, Stalin accepted reality. He granted an extension, but warned that no further delays would be tolerated. The new attack date was set for January the 4th of 1942. Meanwhile, local units tried another attack west of the Neva River into the German lines at Chiselberg. These attacks failed, but the pressure nearly broke Army Group North. Casualties were high, and the understrength infantry divisions bore the brunt of the beating. Unlike the First World War, the German rear areas were never sanctuaries of rest and refit. Einsatzgruppe A reported as early as August that railway lines behind German lines were being attacked nearly every night. They urgently needed reinforcements to cope with the partisan threat, and by winter they had received them. The OKH was keenly aware that if the railroads could not be kept safe, the armies in the field could not be supplied or fed. Even with operable railway lines, there was a struggle to just keep up with the demands of the frontline forces. There was not enough rolling stock or engines to move supplies to the army properly. For Army Group North, one of the best ways to alleviate this shortage was sea transport along the Baltic coast. Beyond supplying forces around Leningrad, there was the vital task of shipping raw materials from Sweden and Norway to Germany. The Soviet Red Banner Baltic Fleet had to be kept bottled up. The fleet was not in a position to contest the Kriegsmarine in a full-scale battle, but any engagement would risk reducing German strength needed to keep the Allied fleet out of the Baltic. The Germans and Finns had mined the Gulf of Finland from Helsinki to Tallinn. This kept the Red Banner fleet from venturing out in large numbers. However, it could not prevent Soviet submarines from conducting anti-shipping patrols. The Soviet submarine arm had been particularly well developed before the war. At the outbreak, it boasted the largest submarine fleet in the world. Yet the Red Navy had played a secondary role to the VVS and the Red Army. It had not received the necessary training, and some of its equipment was in poor shape. As covered in our prelude episodes of this series, the Navy had settled on a doctrine for its use. Le Jeune d'École Doctrine school of thought favored light ships doing commerce raiding, but this doctrine had not been fully developed before the war. Soviet sailors had to learn on the job, just as their counterparts in the Army and Air Force were doing. It wasn't until late autumn of 1941 that the Soviet submarines of the Red Banner Fleet had the chance to prove themselves. As winter closed in, large portions of the sea froze and ice became a serious operational hazard. Still, successes were possible. By the end of the year, the Red Banner submarines had sunk 5 transports, 1 submarine, and 2 fuel tankers. This wasn't overwhelming, but every ship lost represented a heavy burden on Germany's limited shipbuilding capacity. These limited successes encouraged the Red Navy's leadership as well. On December the 18th, the submarine K-21 sailed out of Kronstadt behind an icebreaker. K-21 was an example of a K-class cruiser submarine. Now, these were massive boats for their time, displacing about 2,600 tons when submerged. By comparison, a German-type IXC displaced about 1,178 tons when submerged. This contrast illustrated an early tendency within the Soviet Navy towards larger submarines, with extra room and spare displacement. The K-class had an overall length at nearly 100 meters, with a beam measuring 7.4 meters and a draught running down about 4.5 meters. They were powered from a diesel-electric arrangement in which the diesel engines provided 8,400 horsepower for surface running, and the electric motors ran for about 2,400 horsepower for undersea travel. This gave them an impressive range of about 14,000 nautical miles, and a double hull design was tested to depths of about 230 feet. They typically carried a crew of 67 men, including 10 officers. They are armed with two 100mm deck guns, two 45mm anti-aircraft guns, a few naval mines, and two pair torpedo tubes facing the stern, and a further two torpedo launchers were fitted externally to face the stern. The K-21 aimed to break out and conduct an unprecedented 5-month anti-shipping patrol in the southern Baltic. However, K-21 was damaged en route when a stray piece of ice struck the submarine superstructure. The ambitious mission was halted before it could even begin, and K-21 had to turn back. The Soviet Navy submarines would never have a decisive effect on German shipping in the Baltic, though not for a lack of effort. It was these efforts that cost the Soviet Navy 27 submarines before the end of 1941. Inexperience among sailors and officers consistently contributed to high rates of loss. As for Army Group Center, a period of relative clarity emerged once Hitler had issued his orders to halt the retreats. Yet withdrawals continued under the cover of local command decisions about the best positions for their units. And senior commanders implicitly sanctioned these moves by shielding them from higher levels of command. Hitler remained unaware of these actions, and the army as a whole tended to operate under the belief that what Hitler did not know could not hurt him. And this aligned with the traditions of the modern German army, which encouraged small unit leaders to act independently to achieve the mission's objectives. Despite these unauthorized retreats, Hitler's orders had been firm, and the corps and army commanders were given the excuse they needed to establish a line of resistance. Bock had been relieved of command because of illness, and in the final days he had been unable to exercise effective control over Army Group Center. With Kluge now in charge, Halde and Hitler expected him to turn things around. The northern flank was in poor shape after the eviction of the Ninth Army from Kalinin. Conditions were so dire that its commander, General Strauss, flew to Kluge's headquarters for a meeting on the 22nd. He pressed to pull his army back to Regel, but this was unacceptable to both Kluge and Hitler. Strauss was ordered to hold the line at Staritsa. The Kalinin front would continue its attacks, and Strauss would have to endure without any armor support. The panzers were simply too busy defending their own lines. Konev continued to pour manpower into relatively small engagements, turning them into life-or-death struggles that the Ninth Army struggled to contain. They had no reinforcements, and they were denied any chance of retreat. The result was countless skirmishes that drained hundreds and eventually thousands of lives from the rolls. The Ninth Army paid dearly for Hitler's refusal to allow for large-scale retreats. Strauss and Kluge pressed for permission to withdraw through the end of the month. The commander of the 8th Fliegerkorps, General Richthofen, actively influenced the denial. He fed Hitler reports that countered those of the Ninth Army, arguing that his reconnaissance found no enemy concentrations matching Strauss's reports. Richthofen sought to maneuver into Hitler's inner circle by feeding him information that aligned with Hitler's preconceived notions. Hitler, for his part, was not only inclined to underestimate the situation on the ground, but also deeply distrusted the army leadership at the stage. Richthofen skillfully exploited both of these traits. In a twist of fate, he was granted a corps command within the Ninth Army before the year's end. Yeah, you heard that right. The assignment was short-lived, but the aristocrat did not leave humbled by the experience. The best that Strauss could muster came on the last day of the year. Kluge berated and cajoled Reinhardt into sending a single battalion of Panzers north. The Kampfgruppe consisted of only a few tanks and some ragtag infantry with limited mobility. It offered little help. Throughout the week, the Ninth Army was forced to retreat or risk total destruction. Konev knew the Ninth Army was on its last legs, as he was egged on by Stalin's insistence on continuing assaults. Had he paused to simply concentrate his forces, he might have achieved a decisive breakthrough of the German lines. But the Stavka could not see this, believing that unrelenting pressure was the only path to victory. Reinhardt did not have much to spare and faced his own problems. He had only just managed to escape the Klein Belge, with the Panzer Army intact. And if one is to be frank, perhaps it was not entirely intact. Almost every division was rendered combat ineffective. They struggled to conduct even limited defensive operations, and everything was done on a shoestring budget. As he continued to hold his lines, he continually had to adjust them to maintain contact with the retreating Ninth Army. Hoppner's 4th Panzer Army was in a better shape than Einhardt's. He had not been caught in an exposed position and had been able to pull his units back in good order. Things were quiet on his front lines during the last week of the month. The Stavka's resources were then redirected to exploit the gains they had made with the Ninth Army to the north, as well as to pressure the southern flank of Army Group Center. The Fourth Army remained under Kluge's command, balancing his responsibilities for the army with those of Army Group Center. After pushing back the extended wings of the Panzer armies, General Zhukov turned his attention to the Fourth Army. German infantry lined the main east-west highway into Moscow, creating a bulge in the Army Group Center front. The northern wing, comprising the 3rd and 4th Panzer armies and the 9th Army, had pulled back, while the 2nd Army and the 2nd Panzers were in a full-blown crisis as well. Unlike the northern wing, Guderian was in complete disorder. Cavalry had wrought havoc amongst his formations, and Zhukov had prepared to exploit the gap between the right wing of the 4th Army and the left of the 2nd Panzer Army. During the week, General Blumentritt assumed command of the 4th Army. He had previously served as Kluge's chief of staff in that army, and now he faced corps commanders who were shaken by Zhukov's hammering of the right flank. This was a nerve-wracking period for many men and officers. Blumentritt was said to have spent more time visiting troops at the front than his own headquarters, and at least one fellow officer reported that his nerves were completely shot, with some hoping for relief through death. On the 26th, a new commanding officer arrived. General of the infantry, Kubla, had been appointed on the 19th, but his arrival had been delayed. The attack against the Fourth Army intensified in the last days of the third week, yet the German positions held firm along the Nata River. The only notable weakness lay with the General of the Infantry, Heinrich's 43rd Infantry Corps, which formed the army's southeastern flank and had been flailing about since Guderian broke contact. The gap had already been exploited by the 1st Guards Cavalry the previous week. The Soviet forces were pressing in again with renewed momentum. The Red Army moved quickly and efficiently. On December the 21st, the General Staff was not even aware of the penetration south of Kaluga. Meanwhile, the 50th Army stormed into the gap, with the 1st Guards Cavalry leading the way and the 10th Army not far behind. Heinrich faced the real danger of encirclement and appealed to Kluge and Blumentritt for permission to retreat. After a harrowing delay, permission was granted, late on December the 23rd. Heinrich was allowed to pull back to Kaluga, though this was insufficient, unknown to the Germans at the time. Kluge then pulled the 19th Panzer Division from the northern lines and redirected it south, the only substantial counter to the Soviet penetrations available. To the left of the 43rd Infantry, the 13th Infantry Corps fought a desperate attritional battle against attacks from the 43rd and 49th Armies. By the morning of the 27th, it was clear that they could not hold. They attempted to retreat in good order, but losses were heavy regardless. The 49th Army penetrated south of the 13th Corps, and once Heinrich became aware of this, he understood that holding Kaluga would be impossible without substantial support. On the 29th, he received permission to abandon the city. The year ended with continued attacks as the Soviets pressed their advantage. The gap between the 2nd Panzer and the 4th Army was being exploited primarily by the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps, after rampaging across the front. The cavalry provided the Red Army with a level of tactical mobility that the pre-war German forces had largely destroyed earlier in Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev. They fought mainly as dismounted infantry, using their horses to gain better positioning and break off engagements that were turning unfavorably. Yet the cavalry's nature meant they often fought without heavy weapons and outside the supporting reach of better equipped forces, resulting in extraordinarily high casualties. As the 1st Guards Cavalry Corps advanced with speed, Guderian's forces were rapidly pushed back. The Panzer commander requested permission to withdraw to avoid further losses, but the request was denied. The 1st Guards Cavalry crossed the Oka River early in the week, and the Germans were unaware until Guderian pulled back behind the river without permission. This retreat was discovered on the 25th, provoking absolute outrage from Halde, Kluge, and Adolf Hitler. Kluge requested Guderian's relief, and Hitler assented. Hitler then summoned Guderian back to the Wolfschanze in eastern Prussia on 20th of December and relieved him of command on the 25th. In this engagement, the Cavalry Corps reportedly subdued and repelled the previously formidable 2nd Panzer Group, once led by the pioneer of modern armored warfare, sweeping across the Russian steppe. This period is often cited as one of the Soviet Union's notable achievements in the campaign. As the leadership crisis within Army Group Center continued, the 1st Guards Cavalry pressed towards Sokieniechi. Sokieniechi was a crucial rail junction and a key node between Kaluga and Bryansk. The OKH, near panicked, designated the Oka Gap as the highest priority of the entire front. With the 9th Army falling back in the north, the danger of a full encirclement of Army Group Center loomed as more than a theoretical concern for Stalin strategists. On either the 28th or the 29th, the 8th Airborne Brigade parachuted behind the German lines. Their objective was to rendezvous with the cavalry, but the landing was chaotic, poorly supported, and costly. Many paratroopers were lost, separated from the main force, and they would not link up with the 1st Guards Cavalry until the first week of January. The 2nd Army entered the week of the 22nd still perched in a precarious position, resembling the situation they faced in mid-December. Over the week, the Red Army units managed several penetrations, and the German lines could only be patched late on the 29th. From Ligev in the north to Kursk in the south, the Wehrmacht had been pushed back. The Red Army, while not yet equal to that of the German military in skill, benefited from German exhaustion, poor positioning, and a lack of reserves. Many infantry formations had not yet enjoyed a rest period since the invasion had begun, roughly 193 days of continuous warfare. In the balance, numbers on both sides had converged to something close to parity, though this felt unsettling to the German side. Until the year's end, they clung to the idea that the Soviet forces were simply on their last legs. Halder attempted to bolster the resolve of field commanders, but his words clashed with the frontline soldiers' hard-won experience. Army Group Center had been driven into a difficult struggle in December. They were not yet destroyed, but they were suffering and stretched to their limit. In Army Group South, conditions were not as dire as the other sectors. The relative stability stemmed from how the autumn offensives had been conducted by the 3 main army groups. Army Group South had largely aimed to reach the Donbass, rather than push deeper eastward. The 1st Panzer Army overreached in its attempt to seize Rostov, a singular miscalculation, while the 17th and 6th Armies had remained largely in place for several weeks, allowing them to build stronger defensive positions and improve their logistics. Their sustained posture enabled better supply management than Army Groups Center and North had managed. The continuous pressure from the front without immediate relief, however, dragged the South's forces further from established supply bases. The 17th Army faced attacks on its northern flank, with the 4th Corps acting as the connecting link to the 6th Army. They endured several assaults before it appeared the Soviets might be running out of steam. Then, on the 25th, the southwestern front shifted its focus and attacked the southern flank of the 17th Army, where the Italians connected with Kleist's Panzer Army. Although there were some local breakthroughs, the shortened front allowed mobile reserves to counterattack and restore the lines before the end of the month. In Crimea, the situation grew more dramatic as the Sevastopol assault intensified under Lieutenant General Hansen's 54th Infantry Corps. He had spent the 3rd week hammering Petrov's defenses. A brief pause on the 21st was followed by a renewed push on the 22nd, when Hansen sent the 22nd Infantry Division into the Sector 4. This time they breached the defenses, brushing aside the exhausted 241st and 773rd Rifle Regiments. They advanced nearly a mile. Mamashai had to be abandoned, and the Coastal Battery No. 10 was destroyed to deny its use to the Germans. The landside flank of the defenses also pulled back. The Germans were making significant progress, and Petrov felt he was hanging on by a thread. There was nowhere left to retreat to, and his men had little to hold on to. The German pounding continued, driving them towards collapse. Petrov pressed the Stavka for more aid. Before the end of the 22nd, the 388th Rifle Division had already been shattered by an attack from the 32nd Infantry Division. Hansen, satisfied by his gains, ordered the 23rd to be used for regrouping and rest for the men. Petrov's relief at the pause on the morning of the 23rd was short-lived. Vice Admiral Oktyabrskyi arrived in port with a 5-ship convoy that delivered the complete 345th Rifle Division. The division brought a full complement of artillery, radios, and trucks, exactly what the defenders needed. Additionally, these ships offloaded the 81st Tank Battalion, delivering 60 T-26 light tanks to bolster the defenses. The extent of the aid delivered to Sevastopol underscored Stalin and the Stavka's determination to hold the city. Petrov proved himself a capable commander and clearly wielded significant influence in the highest levels of power. Completely unaware of this arrival, the Germans planned to renew their offensive. Manstein and Hansen granted themselves one more day of regrouping before recommitting to the attack on the 25th. They were stunned to encounter fresh troops from the 345th Rifle Division, where earlier there was just shell-shocked, battle-worn remnants of the 388th Rifle Division, who had stood there just 48 hours earlier. The 4th Sector line had been rebuilt along the Belbek River. To Hansen's dismay, the line now appeared virtually impenetrable. Nothing the 22nd Infantry could throw at the Soviets broke through. As the 22nd Infantry pressed forward again and again, they came under fire from Coastal Battery No. 30, which boasted 2 twin-mounted 30.5-centimeter guns, began hammering the German infantry. As Hansen's corps continued to grind down in front of Sevastopol, fresh information reached Manstein from his other formations. Lieutenant General Spotnik's 42nd Infantry Corps had been holding the Kerch Peninsula, and on the morning of the 26th he reported a Soviet amphibious landing at Kerch. Manstein dismissed this as little more than a raid. This reaction stood in sharp contrast to the Stavka's intent, though. They were in fact landing substantial forces at Kerch and expected Manstein to recognize the gravity of the threat. If Spotnik were overwhelmed, the danger of the Kerch defenses would compel Manstein to divert from Sevastopol. Yet he did not yield to the alarm. He dismissed the threat, and on the morning of the 28th, he unleashed everything he had at Sevastopol again. On the Soviet side, their Group No. 2 disembarked at Cape Koroni, on the northeastern part of Kerch. The assembly included gunboat Dom, transports Krasny Flot, and Pinena, a tugboat, 2 motor barges with 3 T-26 light tanks and a few artillery pieces, and then 16 fishing trawlers. Whaleboats substituted for landing craft, making landings pretty tedious, causing a lot of drownings of men and equipment. By 6:30 on the 26th, 697 men from the 2nd Battalion, 160th Rifle Regiment had landed at Cape Koroni, with many drowned or incapacitated by hypothermia. Another rifle battalion followed that day with a platoon of T-26s and some light artillery. At Cape Zhukov, 290 troops landed in 6 hours, though a few vessels foundered on some rocky beaches. At Cape Taran, only 18 of Group 3's 1,000-man landing force reached the beach due to a lack of whaleboats. West of Kroni, in the Godnak Bay, the Azov flotilla landed 1,452 men, 3 T-26 tanks, 2 76mm howitzers, and 2 45mm anti-tank guns. 2 more landings at Kazantip Point and Yenikel were aborted due to some stormy weather. By noon, the Red Army held 5 beachheads north of Kerch, with about 3,000 lightly armed men ashore. German resistance was initially light, but by about 10:50, bombers and Stuka dive bombers began attacking the Soviet landing forces. The cargo ship Voroshilov at Tarhan was bombed and sunk with about 450 troops aboard. A vessel carrying 100 men from Group 2 was sunk off of Cape Zhuk. Lacking radios, the lightly armed Soviet formations north of Kerch crept inland about 1 kilometer and they dug in, waiting for reinforcements that were delayed by 3 days due to some very bad weather. The 302nd Mountain Rifle Division landed at Kamysh-Perun and faced fierce German resistance. 2 German battalions from Colonel Urs Mansell's 42nd Infantry Regiment held some high ground and halted the first wave. The 2nd Battalion of the 42nd Regiment devastated a Soviet landing at Eltgen. A Soviet naval infantry company at Stary Kratin was annihilated by Major Karl Kraft's 1st Battalion of the 42nd Infantry. The second wave landed about 7 o'clock, and it was repelled as well. Soviet troops seized Kamysh-Perun's docks, enabling a foothold by the afternoon. The Luftwaffe sank several ships offshore. Only 2,175 of the 5,200 men of Kamysh-Perun's landing force got ashore. Lieutenant General Kothima, aware of the landings at about 6:10 a.m., sought to determine the main Soviet effort amidst dispersed forces. He ordered the destruction of the Kroni force, with Colonel Friedrich Schmidt's 72nd Infantry Regiment belacked the troops to counter the landings at Balganak Bay and Cape Shnuk. He improvised by moving a headquarters company, the 3rd Battalion of the 97th Infantry, and an artillery battery to Cape Shnuk. By midnight, the 97th had its 1st and 3rd Battalions and 2 artillery batteries in position for a counterattack the next day. At 1:50 p.m. on December the 26th, the 72nd Regiment learned from a captured Soviet officer's briefing that the plan called for 25,000 troops to land at Kerch. Himmler then brought up the 2nd Battalion of the 97th from Fidiosia to crush the Zhukov force. Meanwhile, the 42nd Regiment would hold Kamish-Buran until the northern Soviet forces were all eliminated. A mixed alarm unit would counter Boganak Bay, and the Army Corps commander, Sputnik, sought permission to use the Romanian 8th Cavalry Brigade to reinforce Hima. The counterattack on Zhuk began at about 1 p.m. on the 27th due to some muddy road conditions. Soviet naval infantry at Zhuk and Krony fought back with 3 T-26 tanks and several infantry companies. A 3.7 centimeter Pak-36 knocked out all 3 of the Soviet tanks. German bombers supported the infantry and drove the Soviet forces back, with the main assault held until the very next day. The 79th Marine Brigade had stood firm but was forced to fall back. The 345th Rifle Division was outflanked along the Belbek, with some of Hansen's troops reaching the approaches of Coastal Battery No. 30. The tide appeared to be turning against the defenders once more. Reinforcements arrived at nearly the same pace as losses, draining the pool at the front. The Soviet position collapsed under aerial bombardment. By about 12 o'clock, the Germans had reached the shore. Many Soviet troops fought in waist-deep water. By the evening, hundreds were captured or killed, and the 97th Regiment suffered minimal casualties in the 2 days of action against the beachhead at Cape Zhuk. Krony Soviet beachhead was also eliminated by the 72nd Regiment on the 28th, leaving only Bolganak Bay's forces and the Kamish-Buran beachhead. Him's division took about 1,700 prisoners, with only the 1,000-strong Soviet forces at Bolganak Bay remaining, along with the Kamish-Buran and some scattered inland pockets of resistance. At about 3:50 a.m. on the 29th, Soviet destroyers Shamyan and Zhukov appeared at Fidiosia, firing some star shells for illumination and following up with a 13-minute barrage of the German defenses. 4 MO-class small guard ships carrying 70 naval infantry secured the harbor mole, led by Lieutenant Arkady Adinov. The Navy infantry captured the 2 3.7 centimeter Pak anti-tank guns and signaled that everything was clear with green flares. The German AR-54 gunners engaged the patrol boats without scoring any hits. Beginning at 4:26 a.m., Shumyan landed a company of naval infantry inside the harbor within 20 minutes. Zhelezhnikov and Nezhamotnik landed additional reinforcements soon thereafter. Shumyan itself was later damaged by some German artillery fire. By 5 a.m., the Soviet cruiser Krasny Kavkaz began unloading 1,853 soldiers from the 633rd Rifle Regiment of the 157th Rifle Division on the mole. The Germans concentrated all of their fire on the cruiser, hitting it about 17 times and setting its No. 2 gun turret on fire. Krasny Kavkaz replied with its 180mm batteries, landing its troops in about 3 hours, then departed the harbor. The Luftwaffe arrived over Fidiosia sinking a minesweeper and a patrol boat in the morning, but it failed to halt the main landings. By 7:30 a.m., the Soviets were in control of the port and they began landing artillery and vehicles. They fought their way through the town, and by about 10 a.m., the German forces had fled after a brief engagement. In a rapid operation, the Soviets had landed nearly 5,000 troops in the morning, with parts of 3 divisions ashore by the day's end. Sputnik immediately ordered the Romanian 8th Cavalry Brigade and the 4th Mountain Brigade to fortify the Soviet bridgehead at Fidiosia. He then pressed for permission from Manstein to withdraw the 46th Infantry Division from Kerch to avert an encirclement, but Manstein refused. Instead, he ordered Sputnik to throw the enemy back into the sea, with reinforcements from Group Hitzfeld of the 73rd Infantry Division and the entire 170th Infantry Division, aimed at crushing the Soviet landing forces at Fidiosia. Sputnik then disobeyed orders, cut contact with the 11th Army Headquarters, and by about 8:30 a.m. on December the 29th, he ordered the 46th Infantry Division to retreat west from Kerch to avoid encirclement. This decision was highly controversial. German forces at Fidiosia were insufficient to stop further Soviet gains, while 20,000 Romanian troops were in the vicinity and strong German reinforcements were en route. 2 Romanian brigades launched a counterattack on the 30th, but were largely defeated due to inadequate air and artillery support. Fighting at Sevastopol persisted through the 30th and the 31st. Only then did Manstein realize that victory was unattainable, and he ordered a halt to further attempts. The 11th Army now had twice tried to seize the city and failed on both occasions. Against all odds, Petrov had held the defenders' line. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Generals Zhukov and Rokossovsky pressed against Army Group Center. Nevskov's Volkov front prepared Leningrad for a breakout, though supply issues and rail disruptions hindered progress. The Red Navy, though hampered by ice and limited shipping, sank a few transports as Soviet submarines suffered heavy losses but gained valuable morale. In the north, Hitler's strategic inertia and German command chaos undermined defense around Kalinin and Staritsa, while Soviet cavalry strikes threatened the Oka Gap. Sevastopol endured under Petrov, reinforced by new Soviet divisions and warships as Manstein's siege stalled.